Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to the Korea webcast sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation and co-sponsorship by the Washington Times Foundation. Our moderator today is Dr. Michael Jenkins, who's president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors, among other things, the Washington Brief webcast, monthly webcast, and these weekly webcasts on Korea Peninsula issues. He's also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, LLC, the company that owns the Washington Times news organizations. And he has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that have met with the legislative, executive, intelligence, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long involvement in starting and conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for the great work you're doing as Secretary General of the Universal Peace Federation. To our listening and viewing audience, we welcome you to our special program on how we can bring Japan and Korea together with U.S. help, our great allies. There's some issues we'll be touching on today that have been very difficult between Japan and Korea, like the withholding of the approval of automatic dissemination of the microchips that are needed for all thousands of products created in Korea. They call it the white paper document that, or the white list that allows them to have automatic renewal of all purchases of microchips. And that was withheld, and now it's being approved bit by bit. And then Korea responded with a strong concern and the thought that they might pull out of the General Military of Information Agreement, GSOMIA. Because of that, that agreement allows Korea, Japan, and America's militaries to communicate all the time, not just waiting on the government leaders to communicate, but they share all information. It avoided all kinds of situations where sometimes America would make some move and the Korean ROK or Japan wouldn't know about it, and now they know. Fortunately, that situation through diplomacy was resolved, and Korea, Japan, and America remain on this GSOMIA agreement. Our experts today are Mr. Greg Scarlatoiu and also Dr. Joseph Lee, and I'll be introducing them one by one, and the Honorable Congressman Dan Burton, who's been chairman of many of committees of the Foreign Affairs. I'll be introducing them individually. First, we're going to meet Mr. Greg Scarlatoiu. Greg is the executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK, and Washington, D.C. He's coordinated 28 HRNK publications addressing North Korea's human rights situation and its operation of its regime. He's a visiting professor at Hanyang University of Foreign Studies in Seoul and vice president of the executive board of the International Council on Korean Studies. He's also instructor and coordinator of the Korean Peninsula and Japan class at the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute, FSI. He teaches a joint seminar on Japan and Korean culture, history, economics, politics, relations to the U.S., and more. To the Foreign Service officers, he is the one that they really receive the best briefing on for a posting in Northeast Asia. Welcome at this time an expert on Japan and Korea, Mr. Greg Scarlatoiu. Welcome, Greg.
Dr. Jenkins, thank you very much for the extraordinarily kind introduction. Well, now you know when things don't go our way in Japan or Korea, you know whom to blame, the FSI guy. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak again on this very important topic. What I tell our Korean and Japanese friends, partners, and allies is that this tripartite partnership is truly critical to preserving peace, security, prosperity in Northeast Asia and beyond. I often remind our South Korean friends that the greatest threat to the integrity and sovereignty of the Republic of Korea is not the Empire of Japan of 80 years ago, but North Korea today, North Korea under the Kim regime. That said, I'm simply stating the obvious when I say that there are issues between South Korea and Japan, between Korea and Japan, that may not be insurmountable, but are extraordinarily difficult. And Dr. Jenkins has already given a couple of examples including the microchips and gesomia. Again, let us think pre-COVID of a time when there was this boycott in place. Well, if Japanese tourists don't come to South Korea and South Korean tourists do not go to Japan as they once used to in large numbers, who suffers the most? The moms and pop shops, the restaurants and the convenience stores and the motels and small hotels. So there is a price to pay every time tensions rise high. There are benefits to be had if relations between Korea and Japan warm up. That said, perhaps to us Americans, it is sometimes a little bit difficult to understand the importance of history and animosities that go back in time a very long time. So, of course, one issue between Korea and Japan is that of history. More recent history, Korea was, as we all know, under brutal Japanese imperial occupation between 1905 and 1945. These memories are still fresh. There was a campaign of trying to very rapidly annihilate the identity of the Korean people. Imagine not being allowed to use your own name, speak your own language, practice your own religion. So these are truly tough times that are still remembered in Korea. One question that I would like to ask pertaining to history is, well, is there nothing good to remember about the history of Korea-Japan relations? Of course, there are other episodes, other invasions, for example, the Hideyoshi invasions toward the end of the 16th century. Again, a very tough time for Koreans. Korea was invaded. 38,000 Korean civilians and soldiers were killed. The custom back in the day was to bring back the salted heads of those soldiers and civilians killed in order to get a reward when going back to Japan. Well, Japanese soldiers killed so many Koreans that they simply severed the noses and the ears of the victims. They were later buried at the Mimizuka, the ear mound in Kyoto, Japan. It's a little known site, but if you happen to be in Tokyo, I highly recommend visiting. I'm not saying this to place the blame on one side or another. This is just to say that history is still there. And I would say that our Korean friends must remember that there have been many more Chinese invasions. And since the 4th century BC, multiple Korean kingdoms and multiple Chinese kingdoms have been engaged in combat. So I would dare say a greater threat came from that neighbor and from that side of the world. So that said, multiple Japanese prime ministers and foreign ministers have issued multiple apologies to Korea and Koreans over the past few decades. We will hear our Japanese friends say, well, how many more times do we have to apologize? What is it going to take? And of course, here I'm an observer and a student of Korea-Japan relations. My sense is that what Koreans really want is apologies for the actual crime of aggression, for the actual occupation of Korea during those 4 years, de facto occupation for 40 years, for 35 years. So, I'm just putting this idea out there, perhaps an apology along those lines. Now, at the Korean end, is there only a history of aggression, invasion, and occupation to be remembered? Could there be some good things to be remembered along Korea and Japan relations? When I learned the history of the Han River miracle, the astounding economic development of the Republic of Korea, and I learned this from Korean professors in the Republic of Korea at a Korean university, I learned the story of the contributions, significant contributions made by Japan to South Korea's economic development. Nobody talks about the weekend consultants, the Japanese experts who travel back and forth from Japan to Korea, helping out South Korea's nascent industries and South Korea's growing economy. As this historical discourse is examined and re-examined, would it be possible to also focus on the positives? I also think that it's important to remember that no issue is exclusively legal. I'm sure there are many lawyers amongst the distinguished participants, and of course, if the world were ruled by lawyers and lawyers only, perhaps it would be a better world, I don't know. But any issue is legal, moral, ethical, emotional. What I sense about the Japanese approach is that it's a very rational approach. I would say reasonable. There was a treaty in 1965 that settled this issue. It was settled back then. South Korea received a significant amount of money in aid grants, about $500 million, a significant amount in Korea's economy at the time. These funds were supposed to provide compensation to the victims. They were not used to provide compensation for the victims. They were used to kickstart some of Korea's nascent industries, steel being one example at the time. So we're done. Again, another deal in 2016. We established this foundation. We shook hands again. Again, no real deal. Of course, the legal side is very important, but I think that remembering the moral, the ethical, and also the emotional side of this very difficult issue will also be very important. The question, of course, is why? Why should Korea and Japan seek to have better relations? To all of us, I think the reason is obvious. There are significant security benefits. There are significant economic benefits. Let's say there are significant cultural benefits as well. And looking forward, when the day Korea is unified under a free, prosperous, democratic Republic of Korea, because you do not want to conceive any other way. I do not. Japanese assistance, Japanese reconstruction and development assistance will be quick. So this partnership makes, in my humble view, a lot of sense. The political view must be there. Basically, politicians on both sides of the sea use, abuse, and misuse potential tensions between Korea and Japan. But fundamentally, the benefits should be there. I don't think this is an issue that's impossible to overcome. If one looks at tensions and traditional tensions and conflicts elsewhere, they usually involve minorities, significant minorities living across the border in the other countries. These have blown up and turned into significant conflicts. If one thinks of Alsace and Lorraine, for example, the history between France and Germany. Elsewhere in Europe, take Romania and Hungary, for example, Transylvania. There are tensions that involve a lot of other complex issues. In the case of Korea and Japan, there is only the islets that here in the USA were referred to as the Liankou Rocks, of course, Dokdo in Korea, clearly under South Korean sovereign control, Takeshima on the other side. So fortunately, this doesn't involve the kind of complex issues that have made mending relations so difficult elsewhere. My personal hope is that we will see revived interest in improving cultural, political, diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan. Young people need to have hope for their future, and hope will come when getting closer to Korea or Japan, respectively, results in opportunity for the youth, in particular the highly educated youth of Korea and Japan. I would like to see more student exchange programs, of course, post-COVID, and perhaps COVID will provide an opportunity to have a reset in Korea-Japan relations, more student exchanges, more cultural exchanges, cultivating the interest that young Japanese have in the Hallyu, in the Korean wave. So I think that hope is there. I think that the private sector can play a very important role in this process. In particular, those businesses, of course, that operate in both countries. And of course, we will need the political will. We will need pragmatic political leaders, both in South Korea and Japan, who will understand that the benefits of an improved relationship exceed the short-term political points, votes that they might score by emphasizing tension rather than the potential for problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. Excellent, excellent presentation. We're always delighted to have you on the Washington Times Foundation UPF program. And we'll be coming back to you with some questions in a moment. I'd like to introduce at this time Dr. Joseph Yi. Dr. Yi is an associate professor in the Faculty of Political Science and Diplomacy at Hanyang University. Dr. Yi received a BA at UC Berkeley and a PhD in political science at the University of Chicago. Dr. Yi researches on diversity, civil society, and liberal democracy, especially in North America and East Asia. Since 2013, Dr. Yi published 10 articles in the Social Sciences Index journals, which also is quite a prestigious collection of the social sciences at the highest level. In 2016, Dr. Yi was selected as one of the top 23 excellent researchers and one of the only 2 professors from the social sciences. He also has written tremendously insightful articles on NGOs and faith-based organizations working in North Korea since the pandemic, and how the restrictions of not only of sanctions, but also the pandemic restrictions which followed really have created a very difficult atmosphere for many of the humanitarian efforts that groups, NGOs around the world, especially faith-based NGOs, would like to engage in. So we're very, very happy to meet Dr. Yi. We look forward to many more occasions to share with him, and we'd like you all to welcome him at this time, Dr. Joseph Yi.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for that very warm introduction. Dr. Jenkins actually invited me yesterday for this honor, so I made a very basic outline of my presentation this morning. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, now the question is, the topic is closing the distance between Korea and Japan. I would argue that the fundamental problem is epistemology, knowledge, that the Korean and Japanese governments fundamentally disagree about what happened in the past and how to learn what happened in the past. Both issues. So in terms of what happened in the past, Seoul's dominant view, official view, is that Japan oppressed Korea during the colonial era. And most dramatically, it kidnapped and tortured more than 200,000 Korean girls as sexual slaves or comfort women. And they still do not admit this basic truth today. The symbol of Korean victimhood today is comfort women, specifically Lee Young-soo. She's one of the major activists. And then just last month, again, she appeared on the Korean media to discuss that, to quote, "I am a living witness to history. All the pain is beyond words. Japanese military stormed into the place where I live, took people and things, and even tortured them when I was only 16. So they came to my home, dragged me in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. So this is a dominant paradigm in South Korea. But Japan disagrees, and they say, we have no evidence that any women were forcefully taken away. And so this makes the Koreans very angry. Why are you denying this basic fact? Now, in terms of why is there this gap between Korea and Japan? So there's different theories. So one is like comfort women are telling the truth, Japan is lying. Maybe the reverse is true. Maybe the comfort women are lying, the Japanese government is telling the truth. Or more nuanced theories are that maybe it's false perceptions. So this comes from Park Yoo-ha, and she documented many cases of low-level corruption, where private agents, private brokers, many of them Koreans, they pretended to be government officials or military officials to kind of deceive the women into becoming comfort women. And then number 4 can be false memories, that people say what others want to hear, and they may eventually believe their own stories. So, and this can happen with people who are socially weak, who experience trauma, not just comfort women, but also North Korean defectors as well. Now, because you have these competing theories, how can we determine which theory is right, which hypothesis is correct? So model number 1 is that, well, we should have open public debate and free speech. This is classical liberalism, J.S. Mills. And that's what we do for North Korean defectors. So North Korean defectors give many dramatic testimonies. For example, Lee Sun-wook testified to the US Senate that in a political prison, security officers killed Christian inmates by pouring molten iron on them one by one. More recently, Ji Sung-ho, who was personally invited by President Trump for his first State of the Union, said that the Kim Jong-un regime systematically tortures the disabled population, such as castrating male dwarfs, so they would become extinct. So these are very dramatic claims. But maybe in the old days, these defector statements were never questioned. But today, government officials such as Lee Young, the unification minister, says, maybe not all of these stories are true. We need to check. There may be some gaps and shortfalls in confirming and validating comments from North Korean refugees in regards to North Korean human rights. So in South Korea, we apply model number 1, open public debate, research to determine whether these victim statements are true. But for comfort women, we don't do model number 1. We do the second model, which is victim-centered. So the idea is that we should believe the victims and punish any criticism as hate speech that defames their dignity. And this idea comes from Jeremy Waldron. So this perspective in both Japan and Korea argues that we should enact laws criminalizing the broadcast of reckless speech that denies the sexual enslavement of comfort women, okay? And so this is a dominant perspective in South Korea and a significant perspective in Japan. And right now, 3 professors have been in prison or they're on trial. So the most famous is Sejong Professor Park Yoo-ha. She discussed the variety of comfort women experiences, both negative and positive. And she challenged some of the testimonials that maybe it may not be true, maybe it's a false memory. Because of her research, her publication, she was charged with publishing harmful false statements against comfort women. She has to pay, so she lost in both civil court. She has to pay 90 million won, and she was also convicted in criminal court. And the prosecutors have appealed her conviction by saying, we want more. We want her to go to prison for at least 3 years. And then in 2016, another professor, he said that some of the Koreans probably volunteered to be comfort women. He was fired and he was in prison for 6 months. And then most recently, Yonsei Professor Lee Suk-chan, he also said that most of the comfort women were probably prostitutes, not forced. And now he's currently on trial in criminal court for harmful falsehood. So this is model number 2, where we support and protect the victims against any criticism. And so this protection, so this censorship extends not only to those 3 academics, but also to those who defend their freedom to do so. So recently, Harvard professor Mark Ramsier made a similar argument that most of the comfort women were willing prostitutes. He was condemned. I wrote an article saying that we should debate Ramsier, explain why he's wrong, not just condemn him or try to get him fired. And so my statement just defending academic freedom became very controversial. And so I was the trending #1 news in South Korea. And so, so the article I wrote in the Diplomat on comfort women academic freedom became front page news. And then, as you can see, when you defend academic freedom in South Korea on very sensitive issues, people were take posters of your picture. And so you can see my handsome picture all over the Korean media among protesters. And also more than 1,500 students and alumni signed a petition to terminate me from my university. So this is a reason why most scholars, they don't want to get involved in this issue. They don't want to do anything that may offend the victims. So that's model #2. Now, the third model is that because this issue is controversial, let's just not discuss it. Let's not discuss the past or any controversial issue that can offend somebody. And this is becoming an interesting trend in Japan. In 2021, Japanese high school textbooks discuss much less or simply omitted any mention of comfort women or other colonial era controversies. So let's just not talk about it. And that seems to be the de facto US policy as well. That instead of talking about what actually happened in the past, let's just not talk about it. Let's just put our head in the sand, okay? So response, how can we help? How can the United States help? And what is a principled liberal approach? I think the liberal approach is 2 things. One is that we don't want to hide from the past. We want to acknowledge and discuss the past. We want to encourage young Koreans and Japanese to learn about their past, the whole past, all the positive and negative things. For the Japanese, that means they should learn about the colonial past. For the Koreans, they should learn about not just the comfort women for the US military, but also not just comfort women for the Japanese military, but also the fact that the Korean government also encouraged comfort women for the US military. And during the Vietnam War, there are some allegations that there were comfort women that served Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War. So there's all these complications in the past that many Koreans and Japanese students never learn because they're very sensitive. So 1 is acknowledge and discuss the past. And 2, I think as Americans, we want to support freedom. We want to support free speech, academic freedom as the only realistic path to mutual understanding and genuine justice. So we as Americans, we want to encourage and support our Korean and Japanese allies to discuss the complex past openly without censorship. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yi. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this time that we've had together with you with such a scholarly approach, which is very critical for understanding this work and understanding how to bring Japan and Korea closer together. Our next speaker is the global chairman of the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace. And we are honored to present to you the Honorable Dan Burton. Congressman Dan Burton is currently leading a global association of parliamentarians, only over 6,500 parliamentarians for 170 countries that are active in the global work for peace. He served in the US House of Representatives from 1983 to 2013, and he was chairman or ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, Subcommittee on the Middle East, Western Hemisphere, all of the foreign affairs subcommittees. He gained worldwide fame and the chairman of the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, as he really held accountable the government of the United States and key leaders in this nation, including our president. He's been a righteous fighter for freedom of all people. He also authored several bills protecting the rights of women and especially fighting very strongly on the comfort women issue. He also stood with Ed Royce, who was chairman of Foreign Affairs in the last few years, and also made sure that America played a key role at bringing justice without also hurting our allies, Japan and Korea. How do you bring that justice? So we're going to learn a lot today. Congressman Dan Burton, we're honored to present you today. Thank you very much.
Okay, there we go.
Welcome.
I've got to learn about this new electronic thing called computers.
You're the best. You're on every week on another program. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mike. I as I was listening, I was thinking back at the history that I've seen on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the United States House of Representatives. And if I digress just a little bit, please forgive me, because I was really Dr. Yee and Mr. Scarlatoiu. I really appreciated their insights and their remarks. And I was either chairman or ranking member of every subcommittee on foreign affairs over the 30 years I served in Congress. I've listened to women who were comfort women. They testified before our committee. I've listened to people who've dealt with atrocities that took place in other parts of the world. And I can tell you right now, after being on all those committees, there's enough atrocities around this world to keep us apart forever. I mean, we don't want to forgive things that happened in the past that were atrocities. We need to discuss those and get them out of the way. But we can't live and go forward if all we think about is things that happened in the past that kept us and keeps us apart now. You take Korea, for instance, the Korean War, North and South Korea. There were horrible things that happened during that war. When Japan went into China, there were horrible things that went in there. We all know that, but we know about the comfort women issue. And so I think it's good to talk about those things and acknowledge them, but they must not be the things that keep us apart when important things are happening today. History is important and we should profit from it, but we shouldn't live in history. That's extremely important right now with the world getting so small. We have nuclear weapons right now that could be fired from North Korea into San Francisco or New York. The Russians have weapons that can hit any part of the world. We have weapons that can hit any part of the world. And if all we think about is living in the past, you know, we might just as well throw up our hands and say, let it go. We have to learn to work together. Dr. Hak Jahan Mee is one of my favorite people because she has spent a great deal of her life going all over the world talking about peace. She's been in Russia with her husband. I've been to conferences in Africa and America, every place where she's been. And she's a tireless worker for peace. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because she realizes, as I'm saying today, that we have to look at today and forward. Remember the past, profit from the past, trying to make sure we never make those mistakes again. Atrocities should be admitted and get that behind us. But the main thing right now that I think should happen is Japan and Korea and the United States need to sit down and work together and find out what needs to be done that's best for all of us. China right now has rattled some sabers about the South China Sea. They've also indicated that there might be some kind of a conflict between them and Taiwan because of issues that have been going on all the way back to the war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. These things are going on all the time, and we have to say, how do we deal with those things? Japan and Korea have so much in common. They have so much in common with Taiwan. These are things that we have to think about to deal with the potential for some kind of a terrible conflict in the future. Anything we can do to head that off ought to be discussed and worked towards. So I would suggest, I've talked about this before, I would suggest that we get a delegation, an official delegation from Japan and Korea and any other organization in the region to sit down and talk about the issues of mutual concern today. Mm-hmm. Trade may be one of those issues. Economics could be a big issue, but the main issue is freedom and peace. And so, Dr. Scarlatoiu, I really appreciated your remarks. I was reading the things that you were talking about, and it's important that we think about, as you suggested, that we think about things that we have in common. Those are good starting points. As I said before, getting delegations together is extremely important. We have had Korean delegations and Japanese delegations come to the Congress of the United States and meet with the Foreign Affairs Committee. I've met with them. I've talked to them. And what we need to do is get them to talk to each other and try to work out a solution to today's problems. Don't forget the past. We can deal with the past. We can talk about the past, but we also have to look at today and the future and make sure, in the event that there's something that comes up, some kind of hostility or hostile act, that we can work together to solve those problems. And as I said before, Dr. Hanyang has worked so hard on this, and I really believe that we ought to use her as an example. You know, when I listened to Dr. Yi, Dr. Yi, and I listened to the issues that he brought up, he's absolutely correct. There have been horrible things that have happened. The comfort women was a horrible thing. And I think everybody realizes that is a fact. As a matter of fact, I worked on legislation and co-sponsored it in the United States Congress and the Foreign Affairs Committee. So we know about that issue. And that's an issue that has to be considered and thought about. But it should not impede us from working together in the cause of peace. I know that may sound kind of ridiculous to say that, but it's true. We have so many parts of the world right now where there could be a conflict that would explode and thousands, maybe millions of people could lose their lives in a heartbeat. And we need to think about that too, because this is no longer a small little sphere we live on. It's a world in which we all are very close, economically, strategically, militarily, and we all have a stake in solving the problems that we face to make sure that we don't have another conflict. If we ever have another war, it'll be so much worse than World War I and World War II and all the other small wars combined, because we have the ability now to annihilate mankind, womankind from the earth. So I would just say, and maybe this is not the subject Mike wanted me to talk about, but I think it's extremely important. When we talk about the past, we could say, yes, those things happen. We don't want them to ever happen again. And we need to discuss those to make sure that we understand that those things happen and we can't let it happen again. But we also have to look at today. We have to look at today, and we have to look at tomorrow. China is a huge military organization. They're building a huge navy and they're using their navy in the South China Sea. There's all kinds of potential conflicts that involves that. The Pacific, that's also a very, very important area. And Japan and Australia and Korea, we're all concerned about that. And so we can talk about the issues of the past, and we could say that those things did happen and we're sorry about them. And if restitution needs to be made, I guess that can be worked out and probably should be worked out. But the one thing that's most important right now is to make sure that we work together in the cause of peace. Because if we don't, and another conflict starts that gets out of control, the whole world could suffer. Thank you very much.
Congressman Burton, thank you very much. And no, you could not have delivered a better message for us than what you have just shared, because we do have to recognize the historical errors of the past, but we can't be bound by them. And if when we think about after World War II, there were tremendous cries from America because of the tragedies of World War II to have the Emperor Hirohito executed. And there were all kinds of ideas of purging Japan and punishing them. And it was General MacArthur who spoke like you, Congressman Burton. He had a vision. He saw that we have to move forward. We have to recognize the past, but we also have to move forward. And because there's greater challenges ahead. And what you're pointing out is the greater challenge that America and Korea and Japan share, and that is security of the Northeast Asia and the threats from North Korea and China. And I think that's also very critical. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to add one more thing. You mentioned MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur came in, instead of condemning the Japanese leadership, although some of them were executed for the things that happened in the war, the atrocities. But instead of condemning the Japanese people and the Japanese government completely, he went in and worked with them to rebuild that country and to rebuild and restructure their governmental plan.
That's right.
As a result, today, Japan is one of the biggest economic powers in the world. We have a lot of competition there in America. Korea, after the Korean War, you know, the United States worked with the people in Korea in that region to build up South Korea. South Korea is now an economic giant. I even have a car that I think that was made over there, and it's a good one. And if you look at Germany at the end of World War II, we were told by a lot of people back then, and I'm a history buff, we should go in and make them pay restitution for all the things that happened in Europe and in other parts of the world, as well as Japan. But instead of doing that, we had the Marshall Plan, and we went in there and we rebuilt Germany. And now Germany is a huge economic power. And so we have taken the past and turned it around and made it something that's very productive for today and the future. And we ought to take a good look at that and realize that the world can go forward and really make things a lot better, or we could mess around and talk about things that hold us in the past and end up with another conflict. Peace is the answer. I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Mike, but I thought you made a good point.
Exactly what we want to discuss today. Thank you very much. We have a few questions that have come in, and I'd like to bring all of our presenters on the screen, if you would, please, so we can have an open dialogue and discussion. One question came in is that, is there an emerging consciousness among the leaders of Japan and Korea about the need to keep this alliance strong, not only with America, but between Japan and Korea? Is that improving, or is because of the threat of China? Greg?
Well, certainly, I would say that regrettably, under the current circumstances, I do not see spectacular proactive efforts to improve the relationship on either side. It's in particular a tough predicament when a progressive government is in the Blue House in South Korea and an even more conservative leaning leadership is in the cabinet in Japan. I mean, of course, it's generally the LDP, we know that. But I think that the challenge is, well, the challenge goes back to South Korean civil society. As South Korean civil society was beginning to be formed and boom in the early 1990s, some of the first NGOs to be established were NGOs dealing, for example, the comfort women issue, the wartime sexual slavery issue. And many of these groups have continued to be part of the support base of the progressive side of the political spectrum. So it's difficult. That said, I would say that, well, efforts have been made to maintain the level of cooperation at a manageable level. As you said earlier, Dr. Jenkins, we came very close to doing away with Jusomia. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the agreement was left in place. So we'd definitely like to see more commitment, more political will to build bridges and to mend this relationship.
Professor Yi, another question for you. have you seen the use of the comfort women issue solely for political purposes to gain favor with those who are angry in Korea? And how do we deal with that? Because that is also an issue that has also divided Japan. And earlier administrations had good discussions with Japan, and there were apologies, as you have mentioned. Even Prime Minister Abe apologized, and there are numerous apologies. And it was on a better track, and the relationship was really getting much better. But a new administration comes in and use that issue, it appears, to really gain political power. Do you see that happening?
Sure. I'd like to address both this and the earlier question about the China threat.
Oh, please.
In South Korea, there's actually a lot of anti-China sentiment. And the interesting thing is there's a competition between like who is a greater threat? Is it China, North Korea, Japan? And there's a lot of discourse that's mixed with facts and conspiracy theories. So for example, like in China, there was recently like a Korean drama called Joseon Kumasa. Okay, it was a very popular drama, and they portray some Chinese cultural products. And then there was all these conspiracy theories that there is like Korean Chinese, Joseonjo, who are involved, who are like a fifth front for China within South Korea. So yes, China is a real threat. China has committed a lot of human rights violations, but it's also mixed with all these conspiracy theories and almost like racist theories about, say, Korean Chinese living in South Korea. And so it fires up all these like populist movements. And so they forced, I think, SBS to cancel the Korean drama because of all these Chinese cultural products that many Koreans were offended. And then, as I mentioned before, there's also a lot of conspiracy theories about North Korea, that they're killing all their disabled population. There's all these theories about Japan, that they kidnapped and enslaved 200,000 Korean women. And so for me as a scholar, I think, I think the most important thing is to have more, rational, critical, open debate. At least with China and North Korea, we had more open debate, so we can challenge these conspiracy theories. But with Japan, it's very hard to challenge, these different claims, whether they're real or conspiracy, because you can go to jail. And so personally, I don't think we should, I don't think we should demonize any one country. I think Korea, we can be friends with China, Japan, North Korea, United States. We should, speaking from a liberal perspective, I support engagement, as opposed to conflict. That's not, so anyway, so that's addressing the first question. As for the second question, are, some politicians in Korea using this for political purposes? This is actually a very popular theory among the right wing in Japan and the United States, that, oh, it must be those politicians. This is all for politics. And I think that's partly true, but I think there's also a larger dynamic where, especially a lot of young people, they really believe this is what happened in the past. I think for both young people and old people, maybe because that's actually what happened, maybe they were kidnapped, or maybe it's false memories. Or for young people, that's how they're educated. They really believe this is what happened and Japan is hiding the truth. And so they're fighting for this. This is a very intense emotional battle. So I don't think it can be reduced to just politics. As I said, the fundamental issue is epistemology, basic knowledge. What happened and how do you know what happened? What is the nature of reality? Thank you.
Very much, yes. And Congressman Burton, you talked about Mother Moon several times. She was in Japan 2 years ago, and she called on Japan to take one more step and also serve Korea and embrace them and love them. And the Koreans should come and embrace them. And she's fostered some very important trilateral Korean, Japanese, and US congressmen's dialogues, and you led those. You led a couple in Korea, and you also had one with Senator Hatch right in his president pro tem office. You had 12 Japanese legislators and 12 Korean legislators. And I know, and also we had many US congressmen that you brought together with Senator Hatch. How did that go? And you're also engaging now with dialogue directly between the Foreign Affairs Committee and current members of the National Assembly and the Japanese Diet. Do you see hope in that dialogue? Did that bring the Japanese and Koreans closer together as congressmen?
I think when we had the two delegations together there, it was a very short visit, but at least they had a chance to take a measure of each other, I guess. But, and when Mother Moon came, Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon came, she was kind of the glue that held a lot of those congressmen in the room and together. And Senator Hatch acknowledged that she's been a real force for freedom and peace throughout the world. I'd like to say something that may be a little controversial here, because we are talking about the past. We should not forget the past. We should try to change the things that happened. And if restitution or some kind of apology is necessary to solve those things in the past, I think we should do those too. If we had worried about all that stuff that happened, we would never have worked with the Marshall Plan in Germany, as I said. Japan would still be today a pariah in the world after what happened in World War II. We had American soldiers that were working in slave camps during World War II in Japan. I mean, those things happened, and they should never happen again, and they should be acknowledged. Now, I want to say something here that will probably surprise everybody. Ronald Reagan, my favorite president, incidentally, I got to know him pretty well. He was at the United Nations, and he said to the United Nations General Assembly, he said, what would we do as the United States and the whole globe, all the countries in the world, what would we do if there was an alien attack from another planet? And nobody laughed. The reason they didn't laugh is because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But the point he was trying to make, and I want to make today, is that working together is the way to solve the problems. This idea of thinking about nothing but the past. I was in a committee meeting, and when I was chairing a committee, and a person came in from Kosovo, and he said, my grandmother was shot on the street for no reason. And we asked the guy when we grabbed him why he did it. He says, because something happened 50 or 60 years ago. That's crazy. That's crazy when things were going on like that. And I admit, and I supported and sponsored the Comfort Women legislation. And I support a lot of legislation that will deal with these problems that happened in the past. But this world today needs to be working towards solving our problems for today and the future. And the only way to do that is to sit down and talk. Now, we had the 6-party talks trying to solve the problems that, well, you know about that. That didn't work out too well. But those kinds of talks are important. Mm-hmm. They may not accomplish anything, but across the conference table, at least you can discuss the issues and get to know the other guy. We've had discussions with North Korea. President Trump went up and went across the line and into North Korea. Now, we don't agree with North Korea on any of that. We don't believe in communism and the totalitarian state, but he took the step and made the attempt to try to solve that problem. So I go back to my main issue again, and I don't want to pound on it and belabor the point, but and the professor and Mr. Scarlatoiu, everything they said is true and makes sense. But when we talk about these things on an international basis, Mike, I think it's important that we say, okay, the past happened, but where do we go from here? You can't live in the past. My mother used to say, you can't put the milk back in the bottle. It's out. And the past is gone. And so what we have to do is say, as Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon said, we have to start working toward peace. It isn't going to be easy. It ain't going to be easy. Russia and the United States, I mean, we have so many differences. It's not even funny. And yet we're talking to them and working with them. Korea and Japan need to talk and work out differences and work toward the future. And that includes, I think, other countries in that area like Australia and Taiwan. And with that, won't belabor the point anymore.
Dr. Moonshik Kim has just written in, if you consider there were many innocent Korean women taken forcibly by Japan, if you consider them as your own sisters, you have to really be careful how you address this. Many scholars, researchers use their research based on documents that Japan saved. There were prostitution business during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, but that's a different story. And what I learned from going to the Middle East 46 times, the situation between our great dear friends of Israel and also the people who live in the Palestinian communities outside of Israel, in the Palestinian territory, as they call it, there's historic resentment that goes back thousands of years, and it just keeps repeating over and over again. But we've got to break that cycle, and the atrocities cannot be glossed over or forgotten. But at the same time, there does have to be some kind of steps towards apologies, but even restitution. I saw my own eyes with, Senator Hatch supported this. The Japanese internment camps were a terrible violation of US citizens who were of Japanese descent. And then it finally was discovered that one of the generals, basically, they didn't do the same thing to Germans. They did only to the Japanese. One of the generals said, well, you can't trust the Japanese, or you can't trust something like that. It's an official statement. And that's what got the ball rolling. And Senator Hatch and Senator Paul Simon and others got together. Dan, you probably were supporting this from the House. But they did a step of some kind of reparation or some kind of payment. It was a very small payment. Wasn't big, and I don't believe in big payments. But I saw with myself and my own eyes that it completely changed. Apologies and those kind of things are important, but when there's no substance behind it, it doesn't really take root. And I saw in the Japanese communities in America who were descendants of the Japanese internment camps, and even some of them grew up in those internment camps in those years they were there. They felt completely released by that. So that's something. Now, people will take it the wrong way and try to tear down America or tear down Korea or Japan, but we need to work on that. Greg, your comment on how do we get beyond this, like Congressman Burton is saying, I know that's what you're supporting. How do we go forward? We must be allies together. Japan, Korea, and America are critical for the world. And American Congress, Dan, I see a bill I just pulled up that you co-sponsored and actually wrote. House Resolution 121 in the 110th Congress. You were there, and it was very clearly investigated everything and identified the facts. And you are very, very respectful of Japan, but also told the truth that the Korean comfort women were taken and abused. So, but you move on, Greg.
It is very important to remember and remind ourselves that our strong alliance, partnership, friendship with the Republic of Korea and Japan is not a circumstantial alliance. These are not circumstantial alliances focused on short to medium term strategic objectives. These are alliances grounded in shared values. And Congressman Burton reminded us, for example, of the Marshall Plan and how the former foes, the former enemies were rebuilt and turned into industrial powerhouses and true democracies. We need to focus on the fundamental human rights, fundamental religious rights, the fundamental right to the pursuit of happiness that we all share, the United States, South Korea, and Japan. And this way, we have to move forward.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, I think there's a fundamental difference between the 1988 Japanese internment camp reparations and the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. We know everybody agrees that human rights were violated for Japanese Americans, but we also agree exactly what happened, how those human rights were violated. So, even when I was in high school, we read many books about Manzanar and other Japanese American internment camps. So we have a very clear consensus what happened, whose rights, and how those rights were violated. But we do not have the consensus yet for comfort women. So when you look at the 2015 agreement, when they try to settle this, they discussed, they just said in very general terms that all these women, they suffered, they suffered human rights violations. So here's our apology and compensation. And that was not acceptable to many of the, to most Koreans, because they wanted specific acknowledgement that 200,000 Korean women were kidnapped and enslaved. So unless Koreans and Japanese can come to a consensus on exactly what happened and how human rights were violated, then we cannot move on. Unfortunately, we cannot, we're still stuck in the past. And that's why, as a scholar, academic freedom of speech is so important, because only with academic freedom and freedom of speech can we have an open debate and actually come to a consensus on what actually happened. Specifically, as Kim Moon-sik said that so many Koreans were kidnapped and so many Koreans were forced away, but the Japanese government said they have no evidence. So Miss Kim, are you here? Okay, so she's basically stating theory number one, right? Which is that one side is telling the truth, the other side is lying. Okay, we want to know, is that actually right? Was Lee Young-soo kidnapped in the middle of the night by Japanese soldiers? Or was this, or did something else happen? Unless that is resolved, we cannot move on.
Congressman Burton?
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Yes.
I am confident, after testimony by comfort women, older ladies who testified before our committee, I'm confident that happens. And I'm confident that something, and I believe something should be done to maybe in the form of restitution and an admission of that to get it behind us. But even if that is continually a sticking point, Korea and Japan have so many things in addition to this terrible thing that happened, the comfort women. They have so many things that they have to be concerned about, just like the United States. The United States, we're half a world away from Japan and Korea. Why are we over here working with Japan and Korea? Economically, of course. But in addition to that, we realize the threat of some kind of a conflict that could hurt us all. So even though and I agree that we must never forget what happened to those women, and there should be some kind of a solution. But at the same time, Korea and Japan must work together with other countries to make sure that we maintain strength and peace in that part of the world.
Final question for all of you. What is the current situation with Japan and the United States and Korea in terms of the security of Northeast Asia? How secure is the situation between in the Northeast Asia area for security? How threatened do the Japanese feel with China's strength right now? And the Navy, we just confirmed again that Navy has been built up to be very large, but not only just large, it does have capability. So how do we look at that threat? How does Japan and Korea see that threat in America right now? And how does that enlighten us on how our current situation calls us to go forward together? Professor Yi?
Can I quick Greg first go on this while I collect my thoughts?
Yes.
Or
that,
okay,
sure.
Certainly. Well, since the 1970s and the 1980s, we have seen China projecting its naval capabilities to the next circle and to the next ring and to the next ring of islands. China's navy used to amount to just a coast guard, and now we see these capabilities being built in the South China Seas. We see those artificial islands and runways that can accommodate nuclear-enabled Chinese bombers. So China has put in place capabilities that can come in handy for anything short of actual war at this stage. And of course, as experts in the field would anticipate, this is just a transitionary stage toward the time when China actually has the aircraft carrier capability that it seeks to have. So these developments are extraordinarily concerning to Japan, of course, island territorial disputes with Japan as well. Of course, this continues to be a matter of grave concern to the Republic of Korea, and even the current administration of President Moon Jae-in has been suspected of getting too close to China. Well, not really. They continue to be committed to the US-ROC alliance, the US-South Korea alliance, and South Korea has to play this very difficult game. China has been there for thousands of years. Again, there have been countless invasions and conflicts between Koreans and the Chinese, and they have to deal with this very difficult neighbor. So the very South Korean commitment to the US-ROC alliance is clearly proof that South Korea is concerned about China, whether declared so or not. We do see incursions. We have witnessed incursions for example, by joint Russian and Chinese air patrols into the South Korean early warning zone. So these are all very troubling signs that this ever-present threat of China's increasing naval capabilities and other capabilities is there. And this must continue to be the focus of our alliances with Japan and Korea, and of course, everything that we do in terms of security in the Indo-Pacific. North Korea is more than a footnote to this. North Korean ballistic missiles have flown through Japanese airspace. North Korea has kidnapped Japanese nationals. North Korea continues to be China's satellite state, vassal, buffer zone, bargaining chip.
So that certainly helps Japan and Korea and America stay together.
Certainly.
And I like also, Greg, what you said, that it's not only a political issue, it's a issue of values, common values. America, Korea, and Japan share common values of a democratic form of government, which allows for religious freedom and respect for all people. And China has a different ideological system, and there's no way it can cooperate or get along. So there has to be a way to strengthen our alliance and bring about freedom and democracy. And we're working on doing that without war. So thank you, Greg. Professor Yi?
Yes, I think for Americans, it's just common sense that, Korea, Japan, United States, we're liberal democracies. We should ally and cooperate against the communist autocracies of North Korea and China. But interestingly, many young people in South Korea don't think that way. So many young people and also key members of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea, but they fundamentally do not see Japan as a liberal democracy, because the current Japanese government, they lie. If they can lie about the comfort women, about what they did in the past, how can we trust them not to lie about the future? So you have many young Koreans who see like a secret designs, a secret conspiracy among Japanese to rearm and to do all, to recommit all the bad things that they did in the past. So they don't see Japan as a liberal democracy at all. And they resent the United States for forcing us Koreans to try to cooperate with Japan. And so emotionally, I think many young Koreans, they rather ally with North Korea against Japan. And so when Moon Jae-in, he's the only liberal democratic president to ever hug Kim Jong-un, the North Korean president. I think for Americans, that's really odd. It's like a democratic president embracing Hitler, right? How can any democratic leader embrace Kim Jong-un? But for many South Koreans, they think that no, North Korea is our brothers. We're united in the colonial struggle against Japan. Japan is the enemy. And so enemy of my enemy is my friend. So anybody that opposes Japan, whether that's North Korea or China, they're our friends and allies. So I think again, this is an issue of epistemology, what you know and how do you know it? If you fundamentally think that the Japanese government is lying about the past, such as a comfort woman issue, they cannot be trusted. They're not a liberal democracy. Thank you.
Burton?
Yeah, let me make my last comment here. I guess we're about to wrap up. Professor Yi is very bright. I can see he's a real student of history, and I love history. the comfort women issue is real. There should be a solution. And apologies, I think, are something that would be necessary in the long run. But to continue to say that right across a short body of water in this day and age, that Japan is still the enemy when they become a democracy, like South Korea, I think is wrong. We are in a world now where China wants to expand. They've had their ships down and they have a lot of control in the Panama Canal in our part of the world. They're expanding all over the place, and we need to be prepared for that. Ronald Reagan said very clearly, peace through strength. Be strong. And the only way to be strong is there's military bases in Japan there's military bases in South Korea. We have to work together if we ever have a problem. And if we continue to have this attitude, they're the enemy, they're the enemy. Now, and when you're talking about embracing Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, let me just say this. President Trump went across the line and shook hands and has met with President Kim Jong-un several times. So we understand that you need to talk and deal with your enemy. If you're talking about somebody like Adolf Hitler, what are you going to do? I mean, or others in World War II. But today, in the world as small as it is with the threat of nuclear conflict, it's important that we reach out and at least talk to each other and try to resolve our differences.
So thank you very much. I think I don't believe the Japanese government is lying. I think that they've admitted that there was comfort women. I think it's a disagreement over how many and the specifics. I don't think they're lying. They have a certain view of the facts, but the point is, I don't think the Koreans are lying either. I think the comfort women have been recognized, and but also again, we have a higher purpose, and that is to come together. One of the things that Mother Moon did on this area with her late husband, they promoted the intermarriage of Japanese and Koreans, and I have many friends now who are Korean men that marry Japanese women, and I'm not talking about a few here and there. We're talking about 10,000 or more, 10,000 who took that step as Japanese women of faith and Korean women of faith intermarried with Koreans and Japanese, and men did the same. It was shocking. It created an uproar in Japan and Korea. It created a real uproar. And now things have calmed down and those families have integrated, and now they're, Korean grandpas that have grandchildren that are half Japanese, and that changes things. And I'm not talking from theory, I'm talking from my own experience. My father is a veteran of World War II. He passed away a while ago, but he was in the U.S. Navy in the PT boats in the Philippines, and he, was against the Japanese. So when I was introduced to my wife, and I married my wife and told my dad about it, she's from Kyushu, and it was a big shock. It was a big shock for my family. But fortunately, Dan Burton will testify. My wife is a very wonderful person, and we embraced each other. We had many children, and it was the children that helped my father get out of that feeling. My mother and father completely overcame that feeling that this is the enemy. Completely.
And your wife can dance too.
She's beautiful. So anyway, Greg, Dr. Yee and Congressman Burton, we've just begun the conversation, obviously. We'll be back on this. I want to thank you all. I'm really grateful for Congressman Burton, our global chairman for the Parliamentarians. He's done a lot on this. Every one of you here have done tremendous work. And particularly, I'm very interested, Dr. Yee, with your scholarship. I think that helps us. We should bring everything to the table. I agree. And peacefully, and not getting to a place where we don't want to talk anymore. And Greg, you're great at this. You're teaching our State Department to, understand both cultures. And I know you love the Japanese people and Korean people equally. And so that's how America, we don't choose sides. We believe both Korea and Japan are critical for world peace, critical for the cultural development. We just had the most beautiful Olympics I've ever seen in Tokyo. Wasn't it glorious? And even with all the pandemic and everything, it was a great, great thing. And Japan did such a magnificent job of really respecting all nations. Even enemy nations are coming in there. But if they win, and we respect that. So I want to thank you all. Great session. And we'll be back here next Tuesday with our next session. And we really thank you again. Please have a wonderful week.
Bye.